Hello, I'm Jamie from Shamrock Girl World, and today I'm going to show you how I continue to grow tamarind trees from seeds. This is a continuation of the Fall to Spring 2020 update where I documented the growth of the tamarinds from October 2019 to March 2020. In this third update video, we'll see how the tamarind seedlings grow while they're in the Texas spring weather from March to October 2020 once they go into a winter greenhouse. But before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to my channel and ring the notification bell for more videos about exotic fruits and how to grow them from seeds. You can also follow my Instagram and Facebook pages for more fruit tree updates and the occasional Irish music and dance. On March 22nd, 2020, we left off on an important day in Texas spring. I took a look at all the tamarind trees after they've been out of the greenhouse for about a week. They all grew more branches and leaves while in the winter greenhouse over the past 5 months. They were protected from the cold weather and were comfortable in the greenhouse on sunny days. Now, they had full access to the spring weather. On this day, I decided to prune Tammy for the first time. After learning about pruning fruit trees for fruit development, I targeted inward growing branches that pointed down, internal, crossing, and misshapen branches. I wanted to increase the sun exposure to encourage new growth. After the pruning session, Tammy looked much thinner and open than before. I was happy to have 5-year-old Tammy and the 1.5-year-old tamarind trees out of the greenhouse and allow them to adjust to the warm Texas weather. On May 19th, I took a closer look at Tammy. It had been 2 months since I pruned her, and there was plenty of new growth coming in. I also moved Tammy in full sun to encourage more growth. Tammy had a lot of light green leaves on the branches. The new growth appeared in clusters. I also spotted new green branches forming near the pruned areas. Some bare branches were pushing new leaves. I also fertilized Tammy since she's been outside. So much of the recent growth was due to the fertilizer. About a week later, Tammy's new leaves had leafed and filled out. Tammy looked fuller, greener, and the new leaves were taking in the spring sunlight. The weather was still rainy, which allowed Tammy to push out new growth. Today, I took a look at the 4 younger tamarinds. I noticed the new growth on the trees after the warm weather and fertilizer. Indica had a lot of new growth and was growing her parallel branches. Tamarindus had new growth on the tips. I gave the plant some Epsom salt, which caused a rust color or black spotting on the leaves. But the new growth was replacing the older leaves, and it wasn't much of a problem for the trees. The 1-year-old tamarinds were in an air prune planter. These plants were short but bushy for their size. I continued to let the 6 seedlings share a pot since I wanted to see how these small-sized trees would grow. Tam number 2 had small new growth. It also had multiple alternating branches, which was an interesting characteristic. Tam number 1 was a very simple tree with a lot of top growth and a skinny trunk. I was happy to see all of the new growth on the younger tamarind trees. A few days later, I took another look at Tammy the Tamarind about 2 months after I pruned her. A lot of the recent growth had filled out, but there were more branches and leaves coming in. I also moved Tammy into more sun because of the new leaves. I was still unsure about Tammy's shape, even though some crookedness was going on at some angles. I recently used some jute string to shape and lift some of the branches to ensure that they don't hang down. I was also trying to keep some of the branches away from the ground. There was one branch that I wanted to straighten out and prevent it from growing outward. I was still getting an idea of how Tammy would grow, but she looked great with the new leaves. Because of the tender growth, I didn't put her in full sun, which was where she was currently sitting for the photo shoot. But Tammy would be shaded in the evening in her regular spot. I spotted a few branches that I could prune. I noticed a small branch on the underside and base of Tammy. I removed it because it was growing too close and growing upward. But so far, everything was looking good for Tammy. After transplanting a bunch of other fruit tree seedlings, I added soil to the 4 other tamarins. I lifted them from their pots and added soil on the bottom. I wasn't ready to transplant them into bigger pots, but I wanted to encourage more growth. The next day, I looked at Indica, Tamarindus, Tam 2, and Tam 1. I kept giving them Epsom salt, especially 2 weeks ago. They received full sun until about 5 o'clock and more sun about an hour later in their current spot. They've been growing well in this spot at over 1.5 years old. Tamarindus and Indica will be 2 years old at the beginning of September, while Tam 1 and Tam 2 will be 2 years old at the end of September. I didn't plan to prune these trees, but I plan to shape the current branches and trunk and maintain support. They were bunched together, causing some twisted branches. Also, Tam number 2 was interesting with its numerous alternating branches, so I wanted to see how the tree would grow. On June 21st, I took a look at the 4 tamarins. There were some burned branches. I fertilized them 2 weeks ago, so they were probably still growing from the boost. They were still in mostly sun and were shaded by 5 p.m. Each of the trees had new growth, especially Tamarindus. Tam number 2 still had its alternating branches. I also took a look at the 1-year-old set from March 2019. The seedlings were still sharing an air-pruned basket. On the 4th of July, I took a look at Tammy. I wanted to keep Tammy short so she could fit in the winter greenhouse. So I was happy to see that Tammy wasn't growing vertically and was developing a natural top. Several weeks ago, I put rubber wire on Tammy's branches to pull or lift them. I used jute string at first, but replaced it with green wire to shape the branches. Tammy's trunk was getting thicker at the bottom, and I recently put a glass bottle in the pot to slowly drain some water. Tammy had a few yellow leaves due to inconsistent watering. I also might have to do another round of pruning, especially since I noticed some crossing branches. But Tammy looked excellent for being over 5 years old from seed. By mid-May, the Texas heat was in full swing. We've had several over 100-degree days, and we had to bag many of the plant's pot to retain water. I moved all the tamarins to the mostly sunny area next to our chicken pen. I also moved them closer to water since the intense heat and sun burned the 4 tamarins. With the new shady spot, all the tamarins were still putting on new growth. Tammy, in particular, continued to put out fresh leaves. I was happy to have all 5 tamarins closer together, and they were safer in the July heat. It was great to be able to watch all 5 tamarins grow together. It was still pretty hot at the beginning of August, especially through the end of July. It was supposed to be in the 100s all week, but we recently received some rain after several dry weeks prior, so the plants received slight relief from the blistering summer heat. 2 weeks ago, I put new granular fertilizer in all of my plants' containers. In addition, we had to water the plants almost every day. But I noticed a lot of new growth on my plants due to the new fertilizer. The tamarins were doing great in the mostly sun location now that the Esperanza bushes and redbud tree grew taller. I noticed the new light green growth on all of the tamarind trees. Their leaves were open in the shade, and they loved their new spot as they would get more sunlight as the days went on. As long as the trees continued to grow and were no longer burning in the sun, I intended to keep them in a safe spot. By the end of August, I learned about growing plants and trees in self-wicking and self-watering containers. The idea is to grow the plant in a bucket that would store the water in the bottom and would wick up the soil. That way, the plant had access to water and there was little runoff during watering. So I decided to transplant Tammy into a slightly larger container and convert it into self-wicking. I used an old chicken feed bag as a liner. I used halved water jugs as water storage at the bottom of the container. I taped a PVC tube to one of the bottle tops so I could water the container. I put soil along the container's bottom and covered the plastic bottles. I carefully put Tammy in her new container, making sure that the liner was in place. I packed in some new dirt and made sure that Tammy fit snugly in the new container. I didn't have many materials together for the split-second transplant, but the impromptu conversion was an interesting first attempt at making a self-wicking container. I couldn't wait to see how it would work. Today, I took a closer look at the birthday tamarins, Tamarindus, and Indica. I pulled them away from the sea of green from the Esperanzas, and I noticed how big they've gotten. I saw how full Tamarindus became and how simple Indica looked. Tamarindus appeared as tall as Tammy. I didn't pay close attention to them throughout the summer, but I was happy to see that they were healthy now that they were 2 years old. I gave them some fertilizer last week, so I noticed some new growth. Since I pulled them away and was able to get a better view of them, I noticed some branches that I can prune off the trees. Some branches pointed straight down, some needed support, and I could remove some branches from the main trunk. So I decided to do some minor pruning. I plan to support Tamarindus on a taller stick to encourage vertical growth. I also plan to convert the 4 younger tamarind trees containers to self-wicking and self-watering. I used the materials that I had available, which were plastic soil bags and aluminum cans. Tam number 1 and Tam number 2 would receive larger pots, while I outfitted Tamarindus and Indica's current containers with the aluminum can water storage. I gave all the trees short PVC pipes to water them. In the end, I outfitted all 5 tamarind trees with self-watering and self-wicking containers. With the new modification, the upward wicking effect of the containers would continuously water the plants. I couldn't wait to see how they would do while they were still in the sun. A week later, the tamarins were looking better. Their leaves filled out and were open, especially in the mild morning. All the trees continued to push out new growth, and it was great to see the array of leaves in the shades of green. The weather started to cool, and it was rainy enough to maintain and encourage new growth. I also began fertilizing the trees and making sure that they had access to sunlight. A month later, in mid-October, the tamarins were still looking great. They were in a safe location in the yard on the windy day. They didn't get scorched anymore, and the sun was mild enough to maintain them. Although Tam 1 was swaying in the wind, it looked great with its simple shape. It still had a skinny trunk, but it had all the growth on the top and was growing out to the sides. Tam number 2 had noticeably gotten bigger. It grew taller and continued to have alternating branches. It was getting taller than Indica, which was 1 month older than it. Indica looked great too, with her parallel branches. I continued to shape and form the branches. Tamarindus needed a taller stick because it outgrew its vertical support. I was still watching to see if I needed to continue to train the branches, especially Tamarindus' heavy and downward growing branches. Tammy was looking great at 5.5 years old. I was trying to keep Tammy compact to prepare for the greenhouse. She was doing very well in the self-wicking container, although there were some yellow-wing leaves due to inconsistent watering. Tammy should fit in the greenhouse, and she might touch the top of the greenhouse, which was okay. The 5 tamarins looked great, and I couldn't wait to put them in the greenhouse. They would be crammed in the greenhouse, but they would have winter protection as the weather got cooler. I was making sure that the low temperatures were steady and above the mid-50s outside. I had already set up my greenhouse for my cold-sensitive plants and seedlings. I was also getting used to the new Wi-Fi thermostat to monitor the greenhouse's temperature. Otherwise, I would put them in the greenhouse if it got colder, such as the 40s. It might be in a few weeks, but they'll stay in the sunshine until that happened. Today was a big day. I decided to put the rest of my plants into the greenhouse. We were expecting a cold front tomorrow that would knock the temperatures into the 40s, and the highs would be in the 50s for the rest of the week. Everyone should go inside, and it was the first real cold front of the season. Today was around 85 degrees, so the plants had one last day of warm weather. I had to figure out how to get all of my plants into the small greenhouse. The Tamarinds would go after my dragon fruit plants, but Tammy would go first. It was great to see how much all the tamarind trees grew over the year. And now, I couldn't wait to see their growth while in the winter greenhouse. By the end of the day, I crammed most of my plants into the small greenhouse. Tammy was in the very back of the greenhouse and was reaching towards the middle. The other tamarinds were on the sides, mixing in with the ends. I hoped that the tamarinds and all of my plants could brave out the next cold and rainy week. But I was excited about the new features in the greenhouse, such as the heat lamps and the Wi-Fi thermostat that should regulate the internal temperatures in the greenhouse. After putting the plants in the greenhouse, I made plans to get another greenhouse to prevent some of the plants from getting damaged and bent and to accommodate more growth through the winter. The tamarinds have grown into healthy and impressive trees over the year. Tammy grew well from her pruning session in March and put on more branches and leaves, becoming a moderately sized tree with a straightened trunk. The other 4 tamarind trees continued to grow in unique ways, recovered well from the summer heat, and became a sea of green by the end of the year. All the tamarinds did well during their first months in the self-watering containers and were ready to grow in the greenhouse's protection. I plan to make another update video of the tamarinds while they are in the winter greenhouse, while they experience an unprecedented winter weather event, and when they go back into the Texas sun in spring 2021. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you want to learn more about how to grow tamarinds from seeds, check out my Growing Tamarinds playlist. And don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel and ring the notification bell, and follow my Instagram and Facebook pages for more videos about exotic fruits, growing exotic fruits, gardening, outdoor crafts, and more. Thank you.